Hello, and welcome to the first installment of VentureFlix. My name is Todd Fetterman, and I'm the Managing Director of North Coast Ventures. For those of you not familiar with North Coast, we are based in Cleveland and made up of over 250 individual investors across 6 separate funds. The funds include both angel funds and more traditional venture capital funds. At North Coast, we feel that our strongest asset is the power of our network, and we rely heavily on that network to identify, engage, and accelerate high growth opportunities. Tonight, we are pleased to screen one of our favorite startup-related documentaries, General Magic. This is the story of how one of history's most talented technology teams changed Silicon Valley forever. If you own an iPhone or an Android-powered smartphone, which is likely everyone watching, you are about to meet some of the people without whom that technology would not be possible. Before we get started, I'd like to thank KeyBank, our sponsor for the entire VentureFlix series. KeyBank is an active partner of North Coast Ventures, as well as many of our investors and startup companies. We are appreciative of their support of North Coast and the larger startup community. With that, we are going to press play and get started with the show. Wow, seeing that for the second time is even more poignant. There's a lot to talk about, and we'll now transition from the screening to the panel discussion. In a moment, I'm going to be joined by 4 guests. As you saw, Mike Stern was an early General Magic team member and served as the company's general counsel. He was active in the commercialization planning, partnerships with strategics, and IPO roadshow. Mark was also the executive producer of the movie. Tom Hershenson was a magician prominently featured in the documentary and drove media relations for the company. Sarah Keurrish was part of the marketing team at General Magic. She shot much of the original footage we saw. She later went on to become a director and eventually directed the General Magic documentary with Maude. Matt is a director, producer, and actor. Okay, let's dive in. All right, so Hersh, we will start with you. As the movie begins in the opening sequence, before any of the characters are really shown, a number of comments are spliced into background footage of Silicon Valley. And you say that the reason we should care about the story of General Magic is that it involves something fundamental, that failure isn't the end, it's actually the beginning. Tell us more.
Sure. I think that we increasingly live in a culture that wants to identify as quickly as possible winners or losers, and maybe cancel culture as part of that. But it's really foolhardy to do that, because especially around technology, because things take a long time to develop, and then all of a sudden there are these inflection points. So you don't know ahead of time, just like a black swan event, you don't know ahead of time what's coming. And it's really takes a certain amount of hubris, I guess I would say, to think that you could know something is definitively a failed idea or something that isn't going to take off. Someone said to me recently that pivot is a Silicon Valley term for, oh, bleep. But there really is something to be said for a kind of evolutionary process in the development of technology and development of many things, for example. I live in Washington, D.C., and there are countless stories of people who were down for the count in politics, and next thing you know, they're back up, a year later, 5 years later, 10 years later, something like that. So I think once you have that wisdom, it gives you a different perspective on stuff, and it also makes you more persistent and able to dust yourself off when you stumble, because if you have an awareness that this isn't the final chapter, let's keep going, that I think gives you a mind frame that is incredibly advantageous, certainly in entrepreneurship and in other fields as well.
Terrific. And Mike, part of the story of General Magic is just that of raw talent. The magicians went on to do huge things at Apple, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, the White House. What was the common denominator there, you think, that allowed so many people to go on to do big things?
It was a combination of a teaching culture and a culture that valued what you could do rather than who your credentials or what you'd done before. The word diversity didn't really exist back then. Dee Gardetti, who was our first head of HR, was a talent scout, though. And what you looked for were people who had done things and could do things and had imagination and energy. She didn't care where they went to school, and she really didn't care what their previous jobs had been. And then, the founders were incredibly good teachers, and what they were really good at was developing people's potential and letting them be as good as they could be. They gave them the right kind of encouragement, and also, and this is a double-edged sword, they gave them the right kind of freedom. They didn't manage them very much, and that's something we'll probably talk about in the course of this, about how much management matters and what kind of management matters. But they gave people their head. And so they got incredible stuff out of them, a lot of which we didn't use because it was too creative and too far ahead of its time. But it was that combination of openness to different kinds of talent and the ability to cultivate it and bring it out.
Great. And Sarah, what was it about the General Magic story that made you want to tell it?
It was fate, actually. I was invited to join my filmmaking mentor, David Hoffman, at a little teeny company in Silicon Valley. I was in Boston at the time, and I knew nothing about Silicon Valley, very little about technology. But he said it was something revolutionary was happening. So I got the call to adventure, the heroine's call to adventure, and off I went. And it was life-changing. So many amazing things came out of that experience.
Great. And Matt, in preparing to make the movie, you probably went through 100 times the archival footage that showed up in the final product. What did you see that drove you to want to tell the story in that footage?
So the first thing that I watched was actually the footage that Sarah shot. And that was what really attracted me to the project. I am not a technologist, and I'm not a technologist, excuse me, and I'm not particularly interested in technology. But I'm fascinated by human stories, and I think being able to look at each face that was sat on the floor wearing terrible Christmas pullovers was just the understanding that each of those people had either made a dent in the universe or would go on to make a dent in the universe and would be part of the creation of the products that were in my hand, that were in my house. And I wanted to understand what was that magical ingredient that was present in that company that had led to such incredible, profound impact and success.
Great. And Hersh, you drove the communication strategy and created a ton of buzz. What was it that allowed you to be so successful in getting people talking?
Well, I have to give credit for the strategy to Jane Anderson and Tracy Demeraz, who was at that time Tracy Byers. But what gave it the buzz, I think, was that it really captured people's imagination. And I think that was the core of what happened. People were really captivated by the idea. But there were other things too involved. I mean, one was the mystique around the company, and it was very disciplined in terms of there not being leaks and not talking about what we were doing and keeping our powder dry from a PR perspective. And, the names attached to it were marquee top shelf names in Silicon Valley. So there was this tremendous building interest that was not being satisfied because things were so quiet. And then once we kind of pulled back the curtain, it was something that was, like I said, really, really captivating. I think I say in the film that the response of many journalists was to say, I want that, as opposed to, just wanting to write a story about it. The other thing is that Mark Peratt was preternaturally talented at communications. I mean, he just was, he would just start talking and people would be mesmerized. It's really hard to put into words, and it's unlike, with the exception of maybe one or two politicians that I've seen in the last 20 years, unlike anybody else I've ever encountered. So, you kind of have this triad of great talent and great interest. You have a great story to tell, and then you have a great storyteller. And I think that, those three things together were the foundations of the success from the communication standpoint.
But I wanted to pick up on something Tom had said. Typically when you do a roadshow for a public offering, and I'm sure some of your companies have gone public. In the old days before COVID, you did them in person and you went city to city. In most roadshows, you talk about the financial prospects of the company, and you do detailed explanations of how you're going to make money, how much you're going to make, when you're going to make it. Mark was so good. The finances never came up. All he did was spin the vision and demonstrate the device. We never even presented a mock P&L. And this is in a roadshow run by Goldman Sachs, right? All he did was spin the vision, and rooms full of hundreds of hard-nosed, skeptical people swooned. Yeah. And that was what Tom was working with. And he did a beautiful job.
I guess that speaks to the vision, right, of a pre-revenue company, that the institutional investors aren't asking you about the revenue.
Yes, yes. And that was the power of Mark as a performer, but also of the power of his intellect and the vision that he had. So.
Excellent.
I think it also speaks to the power of storytelling. I think often companies don't use that enough to communicate the power of their idea.
Mike, we'll circle back to you here. And we are based in Cleveland, Ohio. You were originally from Northeast Ohio, and Hersh, of course, is from Pittsburgh. So very much outside of the Silicon Valley bubble. Most people watching tonight are not in Silicon Valley, and I assume over the life of the movie screenings that most people haven't been there either. So is there a different or more focused takeaway we should have from the film being outside of the Silicon Valley bubble?
It's a good question. And I'm from Mansfield, which is a steel town. And I mean, the lesson is, Mansfield in the 50s was a bustling town of 50,000 with factories and people employed making cars, making steel, making tires. It's the biggest employer now is a hospital. What it tells you is that the Midwest has been through cataclysmic deindustrialization and that kind of change. Nevertheless, that creates opportunity as well as loss. And so the green economy, the Midwest is really well suited, both in terms of the talent pool you've got and the problems that originate there, in terms of what does the post-carbon economy look like, and how to make that happen. And your companies would be really well positioned to work that, and to have the kind of salt of the earth people who come from the Midwest. You're not going to have the same kind of wild parties that people did in the Valley, but you're going to get a lot more done, I think.
Well, it's been a while since you've been to one of our parties. You might be surprised. So Sarah, in Greek mythology, there's the figure of Cassandra, who was cursed to know and utter true prophecies, but she was never believed. Does that analogy ring true to you here? The idea of seeing the future, but it not necessarily coming to fruition in that time frame?
I think you can't ever really know. And all you can do is follow that call to adventure, that passion, and see where it takes you, and know that and maybe not hold too tightly to any particular outcome, but know that if it's something you really care deeply about, the adventure is going to be incredible. You're going to learn an awful lot. And that your work will have value, and maybe it'll be value in the company that's realized. Tony had 10 years of failure before he did the iPod and the iPhone and the Nest, which was sold for $3.4 billion. I don't think you know where it's going to take you, but I think it's fundamentally about doing things that are important, that you care about, and that it will have meaning and it will have value. Maybe not in the way that you see it, but I think when you look back, you'll see how it was part of a bigger story. Like with us, we do medical AI for breast cancer detection, and I know that our work is important. I know that it's making a contribution. I don't know ultimately if Mia, which is our product, is the one that's going to be commercially successful at scale, but I know the science that we're doing is playing a contribution. So I guess that's how I think about all of that now. I don't think you can ever really know, but you can know what's important. You can know what's important to you. And you can learn the lessons of those who've gone before you and give it your everything, right?
Absolutely. And I think for us, sometimes the distinction is that we're playing in markets that are just a little closer to reality. So we don't know if we're going to be the winner necessarily, but we know there are going to be winners. And we think we're coexisting in this pool of those that are competing to be the big winners. What's so extraordinary about General Magic is just how early the vision was. When in reality, the Newton, the initial forays from Microsoft and others were not the ultimate winners either.
Yeah, I think that's as an investor too. I think it's a really interesting, or as an entrepreneur, I think it's really interesting to understand your sense of timing, because I think you can get a sense of that. To your point, I think you can get a sense. Are you somebody who typically thinks 10 years out? Are you somebody who typically thinks 5 years out? Are you somebody that's in a market of 3 to 5 and you know there's going to be a market? I think it's a really useful analysis.
Okay. And then Mike, you were involved with driving and assembling the partner network. AT&T, Apple, Sony, Motorola, Philips, these big publicly traded companies that were often tooth and nail competitors of each other, and each somehow paid you $6 million to be part of the club. How did you pull it off, getting them in the same room, letting alone leaving that room as partners, having each paid you $6 million?
Well, again, I have to give the credit to Mark for that. Yeah, I was his sidekick and helped make it happen. But again, it was his. He was building the ultimate alliance against Microsoft. That was really the point. People forget that Microsoft had the heft of a Google Plus back in the 90s. Everybody's business plan was about how they were going to either get bought by Microsoft or how they were going to avoid being crushed by them. And we were putting together what was going to come after the desktop and after Microsoft. And that was why these big players, the consumer electronics people in particular, wanted to be part of the club. It was extraordinarily difficult work in that their CEOs for the first 5 were all on the board. We had the CEO of AT&T, Philips, Apple, Sony, on the board. And so it made dealing with them more like a kabuki play than a real board process. And it would take 2 weeks to get to the CEO of Sony, through the layers of intermediaries before I could actually speak to him. And then it was through translation, so it was difficult. But the other thing was, that we the day after we had made our public announcement in 1993, I got a subpoena from the Justice Department to explain how we had gotten these 6 companies in the room and how they weren't fixing prices and dividing markets. So I spent the next 2 years sending freight cars of documents to Washington and gradually convincing these folks that this was pro-competitive and never.
And Tom, in retrospect, what was obvious to your team wasn't obvious to the consumer. And it makes sense. It was a big bet, especially at a time when most Americans didn't have an email account, didn't own a cell phone, or even have a pager. So was it a huge miss to be not more connected to the consumer? Or because you were early, did you feel that you had to put blinders on, focus on the future of where you needed to go because it was indeed so transformative?
Well, the film kind of gets into that we were, the mutant came out and stole our thunder, and that accelerated the time frame, and the kind of the dominoes kind of start to fall from that. It's hard to explain to people who haven't experienced it, but when there's a very powerful vision or outlook that are binding people together, there is just this laser-like focused on it. There's the movie Good Morning Vietnam, and there's this disc jockey who's just horribly unfunny, who in one scene says, "I know in my heart I'm funny," and it's a laugh line in the movie. But one of the things that was remarkable at General Magic was we knew we were right, and that's what made the defeat so crushing. Was we had certainty about the correctness of the idea. It wasn't that, but at the same time, we had a respect for how difficult it was to explain it to people. We used the phrase paradigm shift all the time. And as a communications guy, I've since worked at other companies that really are dealing with paradigm shifts in one way or another. And it's very hard to do the messaging around that in a kind of consumer-oriented way. It's hard to tell a very quick, emotionally powerful story. If you sit down with Mark, or Bill Atkinson was another guy who would sit down with reporters, and they would be mesmerized. But those were longer conversations. Those were not 30-second ads. I was going to say that there's a saying that all innovation begins with an audacious act of imagination, and I think that that's kind of the irony or the paradox that General Magic faced, which was, investors want their returns now, but you're dealing with something that is really truly a transformative shift in culture, technology, and society. Mm. So you really are kind of caught between those two poles of wanting to focus on consumers adopting it now because you've got investors and whatnot breathing down your neck, but then understanding that there's no way this happens overnight. It's not a viral hit. It's a slowly but surely kind of thing.
But let me pick up on that for a minute, Tom. I mean, part of the power of Mark's message was that big companies like AT&T and Sony, you know, the consumer electronics giants we're talking, they didn't have their next hit. You know, it was post Walkman. It was what was mobile going to be? We were selling them on the idea that they didn't know how to create the future, and we did. But the problem was that future was too far out. But that was where the alliance came from. Is that they were terrified. They didn't know what to do next. And we were showing them the way. It actually did turn out to be the way. It was just 20 years later.
Yeah. And despite that, looking back, do you think there are things that General Magic could have done to ultimately be successful, or was the outcome inevitable because it was just too early?
That's the question. I think it's easy to pose and very difficult to answer. We don't know. Sure, I mean, we screwed up all over the place, and the movie makes some of that clear. You know, we were undermanaged. We kept letting ourselves be late. We didn't ship and iterate. I mean, you know, those are classic mistakes. But on the other hand, we were dealing with an 8 megahertz processor. We were using the taxi hailing spectrum for radio. You can imagine, you know, the bandwidth is 2,400 baud a second. But that's we're not talking megahertz here, you know, or gigahertz. We're talking, you know, 2,400 baud modems, 8 megahertz processors, and you know, in silicon that we had to design ourselves because nobody else could make it that small. We couldn't have delivered on what we were promising, I don't think. But I'll let Sarah and Matt and Tom might have, you know, a different answer.
For me, I think it's just the iterate process that was missing from General Magic, but that was an iterate process that just didn't exist in the 90s. You created a product like the Walkman that would last for years and years and years and years, and you'd create a computer that the consumer would own for 5 years plus. That's not in Apple's model of success now. You know, you buy an iPhone and, you know, like you're expected to buy another iPhone 2 years later. And the way in which the iPod was delivered and iterated brought the consumer with them, brought them with you, so that you were learning every single time you picked up a new version of it. So by the time the iPhone arrived in 2007, we were used to holding something in our hand, and we were used to interfacing with hardware and software and services. So the consumer was ready. General Magic was just too soon because it was really just playing to a very niche audience. What Apple did 2001 through to 2007 is it carried an audience of everyone into the mainstream. So computing was no longer seen as geeky. It was no longer seen as nerdy. It was seen as cool because it allowed you, the user, to do everything you wanted to do and also feel smart doing it. You didn't feel like an idiot picking it up. It took it with you.
I wonder if you ever look at the timing issue the other way. You know, there was a comment in the movie that it was a little bit like inventing the television in the 1800s, right? That there were just no supporting technology, no shows, nothing to complement it. But in reality, this was only 10 to 12 years off in a lot of ways. And, you know, you, in that short period of time, went from interviews in stores where people had no idea what this was or why they needed it to people camping out in every city in the country overnight to get an iPhone, to be the first person to get the iPhone. I mean, that's pretty amazing to happen in such a short period of time.
We have these inflection points in adoption of technology. I mean, you have it in everything that involves an idea. You know, if there's a slow build and then all of a sudden there's this bursting forward of stuff. But if you really examine it, I mean, I was kind of randomly have done research on the development of the airbag. The airbag was first conceived in 1952. It did not appear in cars in great numbers until the mid-90s.
Wow.
And it seems like such an obvious idea, but there's a long, slow build with everything. And then all of a sudden, poof, people are standing in line, or every dealership has it, or whatever else it is. So I think that's in the nature of the development of technology and the adoption of technology, that you have this moment where, you know, the limb starts creaking and breaks, but there's been weight on the limb for a long, long time before that happens.
And as we think about several of you on the coast, either in the San Francisco area, which has challenges with population cost and currently wildfires, and on the East Coast, there's some challenges with cities, density, and other issues. Are there things you think we should be doing in the Midwest to make it more attractive for the next generation of General Magic type entrepreneurs and startup team members to want to build companies here?
I would say my perspective on that is capital is obviously really, really important. But it's about developing the ecosystem, and you need lots of different things to develop an ecosystem. One of them is the fundamental tech talent. And Megan Smith has been doing amazing things with her company, Shift 7, and going and upskilling and up-teching areas of the country where they don't have a lot of people who, for example, know how to code. And I think that's probably the single most important thing you can do, as well as to create a way of tracking success and growth. Cambridge did this really, really successfully. They obviously have a lot of talent, which helps because they have a lot of people coming out of Cambridge University, and that's known as a life sciences and tech hub. But it actually started very simply with tracking who was scaling, helping investors identify qualities of the companies to look for. And just by doing that very quantitative tracking of the ecosystem, they've massively grown and become really a huge center, in not just in the UK, but in the world. So I think there's some very practical things you do, but I think you're in a great position. The quality of life in the Midwest, the values, the history, the nature, as Matt said. I think just there's tons and tons of potential.
I would add that I think that the culture is so fundamental, and having a risk-tolerant culture and a failure-tolerant culture, and also a culture that cares about something that isn't about money, to put it crassly. I mean, in Pittsburgh, where I came from, there's a saying that you describe somebody who brings their lunch pail to work every day. And this idea that someone keeps chipping away at it, not because they want fame or fortune, but because it's the right thing to do. And I think that that's something that was at General Magic, we felt so motivated, not because we had stock options in our eyes, but because we just thought this is the right way to pay homage to this idea. This idea demands that we work in a certain way with a certain intensity. And so I think that, at least in Pittsburgh, where I'm from, and my impression is Cleveland's much the same way, there is a culture of working hard and keeping at it and not quitting, and that is respected. And I think that those cultural factors can't be overlooked in terms of something that provides a really sound foundation for success.
Terrific. And then Mike, we'll give you the final question here. Vision and market timing issues aside, what other lessons do you think we should take away from General Magic as founders and early stage investors?
Ship sooner, manage more.
I would go with really questioning your employing strategies and look for diversity of thought, of experience, background, and make sure that all your staff aren't the same age or come from the same place. You need people to really interrogate what it is you're doing and check your blind side, and to think, is there a way of doing this better? Is this what the customer actually wants? It's good to have those people every once in a while that are called Dr. Knowns, so that they can really kind of be thrust back to go and question it again and again and again. Because you making it, you building it, you selling it, you're the first person that interacts with it. But you've got to think about the next 1,000 people that are going to interact with it, and the next 10,000, the next 100,000. And if you don't have that diversity of thought, you're not going to have those questions. So yeah, diversity matters, not just because it's the thing to say, but because it brings all of those questions and all of those experiences and all of those ways in which people can approach your product or services. And you have to design it for those people.
On behalf of North Coast Ventures, KeyBank, our VentureFlix sponsor, I'd like to thank you for participating and joining us tonight and telling the General Magic story.
Well, we just wanted to thank you very much for having us, and give us, the opportunity to speak. It's a real privilege. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, well,
Thanks so much.
Thank you